from 1981, which is from the film directed by Michael Mann, his film debut, and starring James Caan. And if not his most famous role, because that's always going to be The Godfather, certainly I think his best role. He's a diamond thief who's a perfectionist, real master of his trade. But he's got a code of ethics. He doesn't, he's not obviously he's a criminal, so he's not got too many ethics. But he's got a code. He doesn't hurt people if he doesn't have to. He doesn't, he doesn't kill people. Blah 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 blah. And he also doesn't work for big gangsters and take commissions from that type of person. However, he's co-opted into doing so he can make one last score, one big one to set him up for life with his new wife. Who the guy who sets them up is obviously a major mobster, and can he be trusted? Well, it wouldn't be much of a film if he could it? So we get a brilliant first hour of setting up the heist, and then a brilliant last 40 minutes or so of him being betrayed, James Caan, and having to go after those who betrayed him and whatnot. But it's a much deeper film than that. It's not just a revenge film. It's a neo-noir in a lot of places. And Tangerine Dream, I think, are such a perfect choice to give us a score for it. And what fascinates me is that this film score was nominated for a Razzie the year it came out, which I do not understand at all. So for those who don't know, that's the bad Oscars, the people who pick the worst of the year. So this was considered one of the worst film scores of that year. To me, it must have just been too far ahead of the game then. It must have been, oh, this is inappropriate stuff for this kind of film. We're not used to this kind of electronica for our heist movie with James Caan, because it's a soundtrack that sets template for a lot of crime movies for the 80s and 90s, specifically Michael Mann films and TV shows. When you think of Miami Vice and the like, it would be kind of watered down versions of things we hear here in Thief, first of all. But even amongst Tangerine Dream fans, that's why I think this is quite an interesting pick. Tangerine Dream fans who think of this just as an album don't tend to like it very much. But people that, like us, who are also film fans, who think of it as a film score, not just an album, tend to love it. It's a Marmite kind of film score, or a Vegemite perhaps, but it's not one that's adored by Tangerine Dream fans, despite it being one of their most famous soundtracks to general film fans, which is quite a bizarre situation. We're not going to, like last time, we're not going to go through all the tracks and whatnot. It's not that kind of album discussion thing. But as Peter said, the way to kind of approach it is, how does it match to the film? What does it really say about the film? What does it complement it? Does it contrast it? So we don't have the Tangerine Dream of the Virgin years here. The big grandiose improv that they would bring to the 70s stuff. It's much more structured, based on a lot more repetition and a lot more hypnotic trance-like beats almost, with, of course, triple layered synths of all description on top, and then guitar on top of that perhaps, and a lot of percussiveness going on as well. There are great tracks on it, like Beach Theme, which generic title as film scores tend to have, but Beach Theme is the aforementioned heist that gets pulled off when it looks like everything's going very well for James Caan and he's with his wife and son on the beach playing. It's this wonderful piece of music which has opens with a bit of fast synth and then slows down to this big, majestic, sweet. It's absolutely gorgeous flow, and it's soothing. It's the triumphant music at the end of the heist that's been pulled off successfully. But no spoilers, because that's not the end of the film. Edgar's guitar on top of it, wails in this Dave Gilmour-like fashion, but all through the synthesizer as well, to give it a completely different feel. And it's very much musical storytelling. It's the repetitive synths that are a trademark of their soundtracks helps with it as well, because that kind of lays the bass, not B-A-S-S, but B-A-S-E, And then all the melody work on top kind of tells the story of the scene. And that's done in a few different places. A track like Doctor Destructo is pounding, it's intense, it's darker, it's bleaker, heavily echoed and full of reverb. And that's from a scene where James Caan's being roughed up by some corrupt cops who want a piece of the action. They know he's got some kind of heist going on, but they've roughed him up. So this is the scene where things could be going awry for our protagonist. So the music does that. It puts him in a dangerous position in the film. So Tangerine Dream's music puts us in a dangerous position. We hear the sinister side of what he's going through. It's got this great intensity and adrenaline, as does a car chase sequence later on, where James Caan's escaping from said cops, and that has kind of much more modern version of a car chase theme. A few years earlier, would have Lalo Schifrin doing that kind of thing with Bullet and the Dirty Harry films and whatnot. But Tangerine Dream give it a much more propelling, almost heartbeat, and that's where the repetition of a lot of the more pounding sounds comes in handy, where the adrenaline of James Caan trying to escape from these guys, we can feel it through the music, through the repetition. It speeds up when he's in trouble, slows down when he starts to maneuver out of it again. There's a massive centerpiece of the album that's 10 minutes long, Diamond Diary. People's mileage may vary on it, whether or not it needs to be 10 minutes. It's got some more traditional Tangerine Dream elements, Tang synthesizers and whatnot. But when the pace picks up, it's something else. It sounds a bit like what Vince DiCola would kind of borrow from Tangerine Dream / just nick basically, with Rocky 4 and even Transformers. Seamless evolution from segment to next part of the suite, goes from ambience to heavy guitars to percussive sections, and then brings it all full circle again. It's real musical storytelling masterpiece. One thing that the album, as album, is criticised for by people who are more Tangerine Dream fans, is that it recycles a couple of tracks from their own work. So one of the tracks here is Igneous, which is close to the end, and that's a remix of Through Metamorphic Rocks, I think it's called, from the Force Majeure album. But essentially, it remixes it to be a more suitable piece of music for the film. If you've already got the perfect piece of music, I don't think you can really copy yourself. So I think it works perfectly to add to it, because that's the piece, Igneous, that really sets up, hey, this is the kind of music that we're going to hear in Manhunter, and we're going to hear in Miami Vice, and we're going to hear in every single cop movie and every single thriller for the next decade and a half, until music changes again for film scores, as it does every 15 years or so. But yeah, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous soundtrack, which I think works as just a brilliant album to sit back and listen to as well, to float through your day. It's phenomenal stuff. It's a brilliant film, a phenomenal film. And I don't think either one of them quite get the recognition that they deserve. I mean, the film's out from Criterion, which, is gold standard, but even then, I don't think it quite gets amongst film fans the love as a brilliant crime caper that it deserves. And similarly, the soundtrack, I think it needs more love from general fans and not just people who happen to love the film. I think it needs more love as just being a great soundtrack in its own right.
Well, I've got to talk about the film. I love the film, and I think it's one of Michael Mann's best. And I think when they look at his filmography, they always go to Heat and some of the more publicized movies, but that movie is magnificent. And James Caan is one of my favorite actors. He is the king of internal explosion. He internalizes a lot of violence, and you're just ready for him to explode. I think he's one of the most consistently great actors of the 1970s. When you look at The Gambler, Freebie and the Bean, The Godfather, Rollerball, you look at him, he is an interesting actor because you're just waiting for him to do something and he just internalizes it. And I don't think he got the recognition, Davey, because he wasn't flashy like Pacino or De Niro. He was understated, but I think he had more menace in a lot of those roles because of the internalization. So, sorry, I'm going a bit off script. I'm talking about acting, but I love that film. Another thing about that film, which influenced so many crime capers, film noir of the 80s, was the wet street look. There are so many scenes where there are car chases or he's filming and the camera's swooping and you see the streets are wet. Michael Mann said that after I made that film, there were so many other directors or crime capers that were, stealing from that movie.
Yeah, and John Carpenter had done it already. John Carpenter was doing that in Assault on Precinct 13. But Michael Mann really does it with the nighttime setting, which is distinctive. Because when I think Michael Mann, I don't think daytime at all. I always think of nighttime settings with Michael Mann.
Yes.
It's and a blue tone. He likes that in his films. To have a very cool look, a very cool color timing to the film. So and he's a director almost like a playwright, where he seems to take a theme and then refine it, because he remade his own TV film LA Takedown as Heat. It's the same film. And there's a lot of heat in this, and then there's a lot of heat that would be in Collateral as well with Tom Cruise and Jamie Foxx. Where to the extent that he even dyed Tom Cruise's hair to look more like Robert De Niro and gave him the kind of silver suit that De Niro wore. He works on the same kind of themes. He uses a lot of the same kind of visuals. But this is definitely the birth of Michael Mann as a filmmaker. You can see it's like the Rosetta Stone for Michael Mann. And for me, it's very much the Rosetta Stone for Tangerine Dream as well, in terms of their film scores, at least, if not their actual albums.
Yeah.
As you rightly say.
And it was disregarded as just another genre piece, but I think it certainly had legs, and it's lasted a lot longer than 1981,
Yeah.
whatever. The year. It's a magnificent film. Did Tangerine Dream create the score based on the script? Did they do the music after watching the dailies and the finished product? Because in looking at Tangerine Dream with a lot of their movies, there are some where they've just done it off the script, a movie that I'll be talking about in this show. And then there are some where they've actually seen the film and they've created their soundscapes on the basis of seeing the visuals. Are you aware of what they did with this movie?
With this one, I know that they scored the visuals, because without spoiling one of your picks, the biggest one of your picks is one where they submitted 4 hours worth of material and then just said assemble it from there, kind of thing. Whereas this was very much scored as, again, Tangerine Dream fans can be quite snooty and say, oh, it's just odds and sods that they had lying around. But it works for the film. I don't really see why that's an issue. If they've got something that has to work for the film, it works perfectly. And when you're watching that beach scene, you're not thinking to yourself, oh, this is just something from the vaults. No, it works perfectly. When you're listening to the pulsating music of the chases, how much sinister it gets when it's Robert Prosky's character, who it's so odd seeing him as a villain as well. He's always the nice old man in movies like Mrs. Doubtfire and Gremlins 2, and here he is as a really bad villain. He's terrifying. And the music tells you it's musical storytelling, which a film score can be. It's not always, but it is in this case. So it's one of the film scores where they're not just setting a rough mood like some of their scores. And let's be honest, some of the later stuff is very lazy. They did the soundtrack to Grand Theft Auto 28, whatever, one of the video games in that franchise. And
probably made a lot of money too.
Yeah, but basically we submitted the soundtrack for this. It's pretty much the same soundtrack. Which again kind of works because Grand Theft Auto is playing in this same kind of ballpark of gritty street crime. So I don't think it's plagiarism when you're copying yourself too
No,
much.
you're recycling yourself. One more point before I move on to my choice is that I always find Tangerine Dream, there's a lot of very specific time signatures, and a lot of the movies they do is the movie has a particular time zone on it. A guy who's running out of time, a guy has to do something within a
Mm.
certain period. There's always urgency. There's always a time element, whether it's a ticking bomb or something that has to happen. And I find a lot of their soundtracks are perfect in synergy with the timing of what's happening on the screen. You know what I mean? Whether it's time
Yeah,
signatures, whether it's percussion, it builds a lot of tension. They are really good at building tension with the movie with their soundtracks.
yeah, and when you think of, tracks like that big suite in the middle that I talked about for the diamond part, it, parts of that are more Brian Eno's film music album, even a little bit Proto Vangelis's Blade Runner soundtrack, where it's more texture and it isn't relevant particularly to the scene. But you're right, so much of it is relevant specifically to the scene in terms of pacing. Their music is almost edited the same way that film needs to be to set up pace and tension, as you say rightly, because it needs to. Because if this is an exciting car chase, we can't have the score being plodding and not keeping
Mm,
up. It
yeah,
needs to follow
absolutely.
along with it, And it's been much copied. So we hear a synth just repeating in every car chase ever after from then on. But Tangerine Dream did it first. They took away the kind of jazzy scores of Lalo Schifrin and put in these trance-like rhythms. And I don't mean trance in the musical trend, obviously, but trance as in, just repetition and whatnot.
Absolutely. Well, if they're the inventors, you can't say they're plagiarizing others. They can just put their hand up and say, well, we were there first, so we can do what we want. All right. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of reverse engineering because the film that you think I'm going to talk about, I will talk about later, but I'm going to go to something a little bit more in their later work, and it's one of my favorite all-time movies. And I'm talking about Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark, which is attained cult status. This came out in the summer of 1987, and it was competing with another vampire film, The Lost Boys. Now, The Lost Boys got the box office. It had the wonderful soundtrack that went top 30, but Near Dark got lost in the weeds. To me, this is a much better film. It's lasted a long, long time as far as I'm concerned. And it's got the wonderful soundtrack of Tangerine Dream. Now, a lot of Dream aficionados don't like it. They think it's a lesser work. Well, bully to them. I like it a lot. It's got a lot of progressive atmosphere. It's ambient, but it's got a lot of minimalism type riffing, rhythm pads, layer of sound, but it also has a lot of guitar that's very typical of 1987. It sounds a little bit hair metally. Layers of sound, guitars, pulsating bass, synth drums. The story itself, I would describe it's kind of a neo-gothic vampire western. So it's a mix match of all these different genres, and it really works very well. So you've got these nomads that just roam America. What happens is one of the vampires, and they're all vampires, meets up with this cowboy, has a romantic moment. She nips him. He becomes a vampire, and then he has to travel with these vampires, and it becomes a conflict between joining them in this sort of quest for survival, because they're very routine sort of figures. Basically, it's not in a typical sort of vampire film where it's coffins and they've got drapes. They're like nomads. They wear leathers. They probably date back to the cowboy era, hence the Western element. And they basically have to survive. They've got a very ritual type of routine where they travel in stolen cars, and they hang out in air hangars or anywhere that's dark, but it's more of survival. It's more, that's their modus operandi. So you've got this guy who's new, he gets nipped, he's part of the gang, but he's got this conflict because, he's thinking of his family, and that's the sort of the tension. Does he stay with this group or does he go back to his family? And there's also this romantic element where he's with this girl who he's fallen in love with. I think this film has a lot of lyrical beauty. There's a marriage of sound, cinematography, and action and words. Some of the script, which was written by Eric Red, and he did a lot of sort of genre pieces like The Hitcher, which I love. Check that out, folks. Rutger Hauer. Some lines: "The night is so bright, it will blind you." It's the thing. I think Tangerine Dream is the element to this movie that makes it so damn magical. You've got these wonderful ambient scenes, but yet there are sequences where there's action sequences, and Catherine Bigelow, the editing and the direction of these action sequences are just so razor sharp. Tangerine Dream will bring out the percussion and they'll do the string stabs, and there's a real rhythm to the soundtrack. You can tell this is definitely a work where Tangerine Dream is watching the dailies or watching the movie and matching it perfectly. I don't know as an album whether it's, and I have got the album somewhere. I haven't. It's very hard to get. You can still get it. If you listen to the album, it's probably not as easy a listen as, say, Thief, but boy, oh boy, in watching the movie and listening to the soundtrack, it just works because it's just the atmosphere, the progressive riffing, the pulsating synth lines. It's just magical, and it really adds to the magic of this film. Have you seen Near Dark?
Yes, I love it. It flopped massively when it came out because it was just after The Lost Boys, and people just weren't ready for probably any vampire movie at that point, just after The Lost Boys. But they certainly weren't ready for something this scuzzy, where the vampires are portrayed as very pathetic, and they're decayed, not in a Dracula way, but they literally, it's like the end of their existence, and it's a struggle just to maintain interest in living for them anymore in some cases. It takes half the cast of Aliens and makes them the main vampires.
That's a very Chloe decision, isn't it? That's a masterstroke, because he got that chemistry there.
Yeah, and she was married to James Cameron at the time, so that's obviously a connection. You've got Lance Henriksen, Bill Paxton, and Jeanette Goldstein. So you've got Vasquez, Hudson, and Bishop from Aliens. But they bring a different tone to each of their performances because they've all been vampires for different amounts of time. And depending on how long they've been a vampire, I think Lance Henriksen mentions that he fought in the Civil War. And Jeanette Goldstein, I think she's from the Depression era. The young girl who's having the relationship with Caleb, I think she's more recent. And you can tell in the performances how being a vampire for at least 50 years at that point has made Lance Henriksen he just doesn't care anymore. He's just, he's desolate. But they still have to feed, so they have to keep going. But
it's just it's like a routine.
Yeah, there's no joy in it for him.
No,
but there is for Bill Paxton. So Bill Paxton still got that because he's
got the frill.
Yeah, and we get to see that probably best in the bar scene with the big brawl.
Absolutely. And the bar scene is where it has a little bit of incidental music. You have John Parr, Naughty Naughty. You have the Cramps with the old Peggy Lee Fever, which builds up the tension. And Bill Paxton actually improvised that. He is a mighty fine actor, criminally underrated. And I think this is probably his best performance on film. He's right up there.
I think it's a great film, apart from, unfortunately, the lead. The cowboy kid is very dull. But in some ways, that contrast helps too, because it kind of contrasts humanity being quite dull with the vampires being very interesting, even though they hate their own existence in some cases. And it's got a great ending to it. It goes much more Western towards the end, doesn't it? It starts to become more modern Western revisionist, and it's
Yeah. But
both towards it.
for a genre picture, the acting is fine. Like Jenny Wright as May. I don't know whatever
Yeah.
happened to her. She's only really done bit parts. She was in a bit part in The Wall. I think she was in
Mm.
Young Guns too, and a few other roles, and kind of disappeared. But she really is really great as May. And I get your point about Caleb is being a little bit dull, but I think it allows all the things to wrap around him, because it centers around him, but it doesn't necessarily, the film doesn't fall in a heap because he's not the most interesting part. It actually allows the others to shine around him. So
Yeah.
maybe that's kind of a deliberate move, and it does sort of accentuate what you were saying.
And the Tangerine Dream score gives it a much different feel from the Lost Boys again, where the Lost Boys is all like that bar scene, where everything is music that you know, and hopefully we'll get some MTV love from this film and blah blah blah. The Lost Boys is, I don't want to say it because I quite like the Lost Boys, but it's a very easy to watch film compared to Near Dark, which is a much grittier, darker film that won't be for everyone because it's not as plot heavy. It's not as venturous. It's not full of action scenes all the time. A lot of it is almost a hangout character piece in a lot of places, which are the moments where Tangerine Dream score kind of sets the tone as much as anything else. It
Yeah.
complements performances. Whereas in The Lost Boys, which is a Joel Schumacher film, there is a sense that we're just going to get the cool young acts of the day to play on the soundtrack and whatnot, and license famous songs that everybody knows. And here we only get that in the bar scene, which is great because that's the only scene where you would hear that kind of music because you're in a bar. So it makes
Yep.
complete sense. But
Yep.
everything else is tone and mood that comes straight from Tangerine Dream.
Yeah, the bar scene is probably the controversial scene in the movie, and that's the bit where it sort of wakes the viewers up to say we're not actually romanticizing what these guys do. These guys, this families are killers, but it's out of necessity to survive.
Yeah, yeah,
And
indeed.
yeah, and the bar scene I think is the pivotal point in that movie where you actually see this is what happens. This is the clinch. I want to talk about Tangerine in the sense of what I was talking about in previous movies, where I think there's a lot of sense of space and time in this
Mhm.
soundtrack. So the themes of this movie is the race against daytime. So the
Mhm.
vampires are inhabiting the night. The night is wonderful. That's their playground. But there's always this time ticking because as soon as the sun goes up, we've got to go. you know? And
Yeah,
the soundtrack has that wonderful urgency, even a metronomic beat. It feels like a metronome, click, 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 the sun's coming up. It's like a race. And I love it. That's the part that I really love in this soundtrack because there's a great sense of timing in respect of the tracks on this particular soundtrack. Another thing is where it's set is in the wide open spaces. It was filmed in Arizona, and you get a feel with a lot of the ambient keyboard padding. You get a feel of the wide open spaces. So you've got these nomads that are just traveling around America in the wide open spaces. So there's a lot of a great sense of space in this soundtrack, which is wonderful. But Davey, it was filmed on a shoestring, and didn't do any business. But boy, oh boy, I think it's really attained cult status. It gets played like once a year on the repertoire cinemas around Australia. I've seen it a ton of times. It's one of my all-time favorite films. So I think it's really, you could say this is really a cult film now.
yeah, I'd say so. The Lost Boys is the mainstream. This is the cult film. This is for the. You don't want to be snobby about it and say this is for the connoisseurs or whatnot because everybody likes
Mm,
being a list. But to me, this is just a deeper film. The
yep.
Lost Boys is is MTV and Rolling Stone and whatnot, and this is just a bit deeper, a bit of a deeper dive into what would it actually be like for these people to have to live like that,
Yeah.
that tortured existence, not glorifying it, not making it seem sexy like most vampire films do. Even the Christopher Lee Hammers and whatnot. It's all about sexual aspects. And then Twilight brings that back in the 21st century. It's about the romance and whatnot. No, this is. I mean, there is the romantic plot in it, but it's not a romantic story about vampires. It's a vampire film partially, because it's not completely a vampire film. It's got a lot more going for it, but it's a vampire film that's got a romance in it rather than a romantic vampire film.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I saw that, every Catherine Bigelow film since, I've caught up with. She is a filmmaker of some note, and
Yeah, and I loved it when she beat James Cameron to the Oscar for what was it called, The Hurt Locker. She won Best Director, and she was up against her ex-husband for that. He was up for Avatar, and she beat him, which, oh, that must have been glorious for a woman who's coming off a divorce too. That must have just.
Alrighty.
James Cameron. Very easy to hate James Cameron.
Oh, James Cameron, he's a larger than life camera. We could do a whole episode on him, that guy. But anyway,